You know, there are moments in history that get buried so deep, people forget they ever happened. Moments where one man's decision changes everything, where pride meets power and innocent people pay the price. This is one of those stories. A story about a colonel who thought he was above the law, who believed his uniform gave him the right to play God, and who learned the hard way that even in the lawless Wild West, some lines should never be crossed. What happened next? Well, let me tell you, it's something that'll make your blood run cold and your sense of justice burn hot. So before we dive into this tale of revenge, tragedy, and ultimate reckoning, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me what you think justice really means. Because by the end of this story, you might just change your mind about what you thought you knew. Let's get into it. The year was 1873, and the town of Copper Ridge sat nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges in what would later become New Mexico territory. It wasn't much to look at, just another dusty collection of wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, and maybe 30 families trying to scratch out a living from land that didn't want to give up anything easily. These weren't outlaws or desperados. These were farmers, shopkeepers, a blacksmith named Thomas Garrett who could shoe a horse better than any man in 3 counties, a school teacher named Margaret Wells who taught reading to children in a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as the town meeting hall on Sundays, and a doctor named Samuel Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd earned the respect of every soul in town by saving lives without asking questions or demanding payment folks couldn't afford. Life was hard, sure, but it was peaceful. The kind of peace where neighbors helped neighbors, where handshakes meant something, and where a man's word was his bond. That peace was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. The trouble started when Colonel Marcus Thornhill arrived with his cavalry unit, about 40 soldiers strong, supposedly on a mission to root out a band of outlaws who'd been raiding supply trains headed west. Now, Thornhill wasn't your typical military man. He came from old money back east, from a family that had built its fortune on the backs of others, and he carried himself like someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. He was tall, with a thick mustache waxed to sharp points, eyes that were cold as winter ice, and a way of looking at people like they were obstacles in his path rather than human beings. His men feared him more than they respected him, and that's never a good sign. A good officer leads through respect. Thornhill led through terror. He'd made his reputation during the Civil War, not through brilliant strategy or courageous leadership, but through ruthless efficiency and a willingness to do things other officers wouldn't stomach. There were whispers about villages burned, prisoners who never made it to camps, orders given in the dead of night that left no witnesses. But whispers don't stick to men with money and connections, and Thornhill had plenty of both. When Thornhill and his men rode into Copper Ridge on a Tuesday morning, the townspeople did what any decent folks would do. They welcomed them. Margaret Wells even arranged for the school children to wave little flags they'd made. The saloon owner, a former Union soldier named Patrick O'Malley, who'd lost his left arm at Gettysburg, offered the colonel and his officers free drinks. Thomas Garrett made sure the cavalry horses were properly stabled and fed. This was hospitality, Western style, the kind that came from genuine kindness rather than obligation. But Thornhill, he didn't see kindness, he saw weakness. He saw a town of simple people who should be grateful that men like him existed to protect them. He saw opportunity. And that's when things started to go wrong. The first night, Thornhill's men drank heavily at O'Malley's saloon, and there was an incident. One of the soldiers, A young private, barely old enough to shave, got into an argument with a local farmer over a card game. Voices were raised, chairs were knocked over, and before anyone could calm things down, the private pulled his sidearm. Now O'Malley was a man who'd seen enough violence for 10 lifetimes, and he stepped in quick, using his one good arm to grab the soldier's wrist and redirect the gun toward the ceiling. No shots fired, no one hurt, just a tense moment diffused by a man who knew how to handle trouble. But Thornhill heard about it, and instead of disciplining his soldier for drawing on a civilian, he stormed into that saloon the next morning with fury in his eyes. He demanded O'Malley apologize to his private. Apologize for stopping a man from potentially shooting someone over a card game. O'Malley, being the man he was, just looked Thornhill in the eye and said no. Simple as that. No. And something in Thornhill snapped. Over the next few days, Thornhill became increasingly hostile toward the townspeople. He claimed they weren't cooperating with his investigation into the outlaws, that they were hiding information, that maybe they were even sympathetic to the criminals he was hunting. None of it was true. The outlaws he was looking for had never even been near Copper Ridge. They were operating 2 territories over, hitting trains on completely different routes. But truth didn't matter to Thornhill. He'd been challenged, his authority questioned by a one-armed saloon keeper in front of his men, and his pride couldn't handle it. So he started pushing. He had his soldiers search homes without permission, demanding to see supply stores, asking aggressive questions about where people had been and who they'd seen. He imposed a curfew, saying anyone out at dark would be considered suspicious. He took over the general store's back room as his headquarters and helped himself to supplies without offering payment. The town was under occupation, and everyone knew it. Dr. Chen was the first to speak up. At a town meeting held in that little schoolhouse, with maybe 20 adults crammed into a space meant for children, Chen stood up and addressed the crowd in his careful, precise English. He said what everyone was thinking but was afraid to say. This wasn't right. They were American citizens, or at least residents with rights, and Thornhill had no legal authority to treat them like prisoners in their own town. Someone needed to file a formal complaint with the territorial governor. Someone needed to stand up. Margaret Wells agreed. Thomas Garrett, usually a quiet man who preferred his forge to politics, nodded his head. Patrick O'Malley slammed his good hand on a desk and said they should ride to the nearest fort and demand Thornhill be removed. It was decided. They'd send a delegation. 3 people would ride out at first light before Thornhill could stop them, and they'd make sure the proper authorities knew what was happening in Copper Ridge. But Thornhill had a spy, one of the townspeople, a man deep in gambling debt who saw an opportunity to earn favor with the colonel, overheard the plan, and went straight to Thornhill's headquarters. The informant's name was William Jessup, and before you think too harshly of him, understand that he was desperate, scared, and made a choice he'd regret for the rest of his days. He told Thornhill everything. About the meeting, about the delegation, about the plan to report him to higher authorities. And Thornhill? He smiled. That cold, cruel smile of a man who'd just been given an excuse to do what he'd wanted to do all along. The next morning, before dawn could even think about breaking over those mountains, Thornhill assembled his entire unit in the middle of town. He had his men drag families from their homes, men, women, children still in their night clothes, confused and terrified. He ordered everyone into the town square, that open area in front of the general store where folks usually gathered for celebrations and auctions. There must have been 70 people there, maybe 80, including kids too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the fear radiating from their parents. Thornhill sat on his horse, elevated above the crowd, backlit by torches his men had lit, looking for all the world like some kind of dark judge preparing to deliver a verdict. He didn't waste time with a long speech. He told the assembled townspeople that he knew about their plan. He knew about their conspiracy to interfere with the military operation. He knew they were harboring sympathies for outlaws and criminals. All lies, but he said them with such conviction, such authority, that you could see some of his younger soldiers actually believing him. Then Thornhill said something that made every person in that square go cold. He said that conspiracy against military authority during a time of operation was tantamount to treason. He said that traitors, even civilian traitors, could be subject to military justice. He said that to restore order and ensure compliance, an example needed to be made. And then he gave an order that no man with a conscience could follow. He ordered his men to select 10 townspeople at random and prepare them for execution by firing squad. The silence that followed was the kind that exists just before an avalanche, that moment where the whole world holds its breath because it knows something terrible is about to happen. Then the screaming started, parents clutching their children, men stepping forward to volunteer themselves if it meant sparing others, women begging for mercy. Margaret Wells stepped forward, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos, demanding to know by what authority Thornhill claimed the right to execute civilians without trial. Thomas Garrett moved to stand beside her, his broad blacksmith's frame positioning itself between the soldiers and the families. Dr. Chen pushed his way to the front, his medical bag still in his hand from treating a child's fever just hours before, and told Thornhill in a clear voice that history would remember this as murder, not justice. Thornhill's response was to have his men seize all 3 of them immediately. Margaret Wells, Thomas Garrett, and Samuel Chen were grabbed by soldiers and dragged toward the wall of the general store. Patrick O'Malley rushed forward, shouting that this was madness, that they were innocent people, and he was clubbed to the ground with a rifle butt for his trouble. William Jessup, the informant who'd set all this in motion, stood at the back of the crowd, his face pale as death, realizing too late what his information had enabled. Thornhill selected 7 more townspeople, seemingly at random, though historians would later note he chose the ones who'd been most vocal, most independent, most likely to resist. Among them was a teenage boy named Daniel, barely 16, whose only crime was being Thomas Garrett's apprentice. Among them was Mary Sullivan, a grandmother who ran the boarding house and was known for her charity toward travelers who couldn't pay. 10 people total, standing against that wall, with 40 rifles being raised to aim at them.
This is the moment. This is where you need to understand what happened next, because it's not what you think. Thornhill gave the order to fire, but something unexpected occurred. Out of those 40 soldiers, only 12 actually pulled their triggers. Only 12. The rest, whether from conscience, horror, or simple human decency, couldn't do it. They couldn't fire on unarmed civilians standing against a wall. Some lowered their rifles at the last second. Some fired deliberately into the ground. Some just stood there, frozen, unable to make their fingers work. But 12 rifles did fire, and that was enough. Thomas Garrett took 3 bullets and fell where he stood, dead before he hit the ground. Margaret Wells was hit twice, once in the chest and once in the throat, and died within seconds. Samuel Chen tried to shield young Daniel with his own body and took the bullets meant for the boy, but one shot went through and hit Daniel anyway. The doctor lived for almost 30 agonizing seconds before his eyes went glassy. Daniel survived, bleeding from a shoulder wound, lying there among the bodies. Of the 10 people against that wall, 6 died immediately. 2 more, including Mary Sullivan, died from their wounds within the hour despite desperate attempts to save them. 2 survived, Daniel and a man named Joseph Creek who'd taken a bullet in the leg. The town square became a scene from hell itself, families rushing to the bodies, soldiers standing there in shock at what they'd just done. the smell of gunpowder mixing with blood and tears. Thornhill sat on his horse, surveying the carnage with what witnesses later described as satisfaction. He told his men to clear the square, to get the bodies out of sight, to restore order. He told the townspeople that this was necessary, that this would prevent further conspiracy, that they should blame themselves for forcing his hand. Then he rode back to his headquarters, dismounted, and went inside to have his breakfast like he'd just completed routine military business rather than ordered the execution of innocent civilians. But here's what Thornhill didn't know. Here's what his arrogance and his pride and his absolute certainty in his own superiority blinded him to. Among his own men, among those 40 soldiers who'd stood in that square, seeds of rebellion were being planted. The soldiers who'd refused to fire were being looked at as heroes by their comrades. The ones who had fired were dealing with guilt and horror and the realization that they just murdered people who didn't deserve to die. A sergeant named Robert Hayes, a career military man who'd served with distinction for 15 years, gathered a group of soldiers that afternoon in the stable. He told them quietly that what had happened wasn't military justice, it was murder. It was wrong, and someone needed to make it right. Hayes couldn't directly disobey orders without being executed himself, but he could make sure the truth got out. He could make sure someone with actual authority knew what Thornhill had done.
Hayes wrote a detailed letter that night, documenting everything. The executions, the lack of any real evidence of conspiracy, the fact that Thornhill had executed civilians without trial or proper authority. He included testimony from 5 other soldiers who witnessed everything. Then he gave that letter to a young private named Timothy Walsh, a kid from Ohio who joined the Army to see the West and was now traumatized by what he'd witnessed. Hayes ordered Walsh, officially, to ride to Fort Sumner, 3 days away, with dispatches. That was the official story. Unofficially, Walsh had that letter hidden in his saddlebag, and Hayes had given him explicit instructions to hand-deliver it to Colonel Andrew Mackenzie, the fort commander, personally. No adjutants, no intermediaries. Mackenzie himself, because Hayes knew Mackenzie's reputation. The man was old-school military, a stickler for regulations and proper conduct, and he had no patience for officers who brought shame to the uniform. If anyone would hold Thornhill accountable, it would be Mackenzie. While Walsh rode hard for Fort Sumner, Copper Ridge was trying to bury its dead and process the trauma. The town had lost 8 people, 8 members of a community that couldn't afford to lose anyone. The grief was overwhelming. But mixed with that grief was something else, something harder, sharper, anger, the kind of anger that burns slow and hot and doesn't go out. Patrick O'Malley, still nursing a concussion from being clubbed, started talking to people, quietly at first, then more openly. He reminded folks that Margaret Wells had been right. They were American citizens. They had rights. What Thornhill did was murder, and murders don't get to hide behind uniforms. Joseph Creek, recovering from his leg wound, said that Thomas Garrett had always believed in justice, real justice, and that the best way to honor his memory was to make sure justice was served. Even William Jessup, the informant, came forward, tears streaming down his face, confessing what he'd done and begging for a chance to make it right. The town didn't forgive him, not really, but they recognized that his guilt was genuine and his information about Thornhill's routine might be useful. Here's where the story takes a turn that shows you just how deep loyalty can run and how far people will go when they've been pushed too far. Among those 40 soldiers, the ones who'd stood in that square, 28 of them met in secret one night. They met in an old barn on the edge of town, and they made a pact. If Thornhill wasn't held accountable through official channels, if the Army tried to cover this up or protect him because of his connections back east, then they would take matters into their own hands. They would testify against him, even if it meant courts-martial for themselves. They would make sure the story got out to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. And if all that failed, well, there were 28 of them and only one of him.
They didn't spell it out more clearly than that, but everyone in that barn understood what was being suggested. Sometimes, when the system fails, people create their own justice. Right or wrong, that's human nature.
3 days passed. Thornhill kept his men busy with patrols that went nowhere, searching for outlaws that didn't exist in the area, maintaining the appearance of legitimate military operation. He kept the townspeople under his thumb with continued curfews and restrictions, reminding them daily that he was in charge and they were subject to his authority. He seemed to believe that the executions had solved his problem, that the town was cowed, that his power was absolute. He had no idea that Private Walsh had reached Fort Sumner, that Colonel Mackenzie was reading Sergeant Hayes' letter with mounting fury, that orders were being drafted for Thornhill's immediate arrest. He had no idea that his own men were meeting in secret, planning potential mutiny. He had no idea that newspapers as far away as Denver and Santa Fe were starting to hear whispers about what happened in Copper Ridge. The walls were closing in, but Thornhill couldn't see them because his arrogance had made him blind. The reckoning came on a Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after the executions. The town was holding a memorial service in that little church with the crooked steeple. Almost everyone had gathered there, soldiers included, because even Thornhill's authority couldn't prevent people from mourning their dead. The service was being led by the town's part-time preacher, a farmer named Eli Stone, who knew Scripture better than any ordained minister and who spoke with quiet power about justice, mercy, and the sin of taking innocent life. The pews were packed. People were standing against the walls. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. And then, in the middle of Eli Stone's sermon, the church doors burst open. Colonel Andrew Mackenzie entered, followed by 20 soldiers from Fort Sumner, all heavily armed and looking like they meant business.
Mackenzie was everything Thornhill wasn't. Where Thornhill was tall and imposing, Mackenzie was average height and built like a barrel, all muscle and no flash. Where Thornhill's eyes were cold, Mackenzie's burned with barely contained fury. The fort commander walked down the center aisle of that church, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and every eye followed him. He stopped in front of the altar, turned to face the congregation, and addressed them in a voice that carried to every corner of the building. He said he'd come to investigate reports of serious misconduct by military personnel operating in the area. He said that Colonel Marcus Thornhill was to be placed under immediate arrest pending courts-martial for multiple charges including murder of civilians, abuse of military authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He said that any soldiers who had participated in the executions would be required to give testimony, but were also offered protection if they cooperated fully with the investigation. Then, Mackenzie did something remarkable. He apologized. On behalf of the United States Army, on behalf of every man and woman who wore the uniform with honor, he apologized to the people of Copper Ridge for what had been done to them. The silence in that church was profound. Then Patrick O'Malley stood up from his pew. Using his one good arm, he started clapping. Joseph Creek stood and joined him. One by one, every person in that church rose to their feet, applauding not because the pain was gone or because the dead were coming back, but because someone had finally acknowledged what they'd endured. Someone with power had said out loud that what happened to them was wrong. It seems like a small thing, but for people who'd been treated like their lives didn't matter, that acknowledgement was everything. Thornhill wasn't at the service, of course. He was in his commandeered headquarters, probably enjoying the quiet of having most of the town occupied elsewhere. Mackenzie took 10 of his soldiers and marched straight there. They didn't knock. They kicked the door in, military style, and entered to find Thornhill sitting at a desk, going through supply ledgers like he had any business doing so. The colonel looked up, more annoyed than alarmed, and actually had the audacity to complain about the interruption. Mackenzie didn't give him time to work up a full complaint. He read the charges clearly and formally, then ordered his men to place Thornhill in irons. Real irons, wrist and ankle chains, the kind usually reserved for deserters and murderers. Because that's what Thornhill was. A murderer.
Now Thornhill's arrogance finally cracked. He sputtered about his rights, his connections, his family's influence. He threatened Mackenzie with career destruction, promised that powerful people back east would hear about this treatment, demanded to know who had dared to make accusations against him. Mackenzie let him talk, let him bluster and threaten. And when Thornhill finally ran out of steam, the fort commander leaned in close and said something that witnesses reported with grim satisfaction. He said that all the money and connections in the world wouldn't help him, because 28 soldiers and an entire town were prepared to testify about what he'd done. He said that newspapers from here to Washington were going to hear the full story. He said that Thornhill's name would become synonymous with disgrace and murder, and that history would remember him not as a colonel, but as a coward who ordered defenseless civilians executed because his pride was hurt. Then Mackenzie had Thornhill dragged out of there in chains, put on a horse, and started the journey back to Fort Sumner to await trial. The trial, when it finally happened 3 months later, was a sensation. Journalists came from everywhere. Artists sketched scenes from the courtroom. Every major newspaper in the country covered it. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Sergeant Hayes testified, describing the executions in detail. 28 soldiers corroborated his account. Joseph Creek and Daniel, the survivors, told their stories. Patrick O'Malley described the atmosphere of fear and oppression. William Jessup confessed his role and begged the court to hold Thornhill responsible for exploiting his weakness. Even some of the soldiers who'd fired their weapons testified, several of them breaking down in tears as they described how they'd followed orders they knew were wrong out of fear of their commander. The defense tried to argue military necessity, claimed Thornhill had reasonable suspicion of conspiracy, suggested that the townspeople had brought this on themselves. None of it worked. The evidence was too clear, the witness testimony too consistent, the crime too obvious.
The court-martial board deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Colonel Marcus Thornhill guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad, the same method he'd used on his victims, the same military justice he'd claimed to be dispensing. There's a bit of poetry in that, isn't there? But here's something interesting that a lot of people don't know about this case. The sentence was never carried out. Thornhill's family, wealthy and connected as they were, managed to get the execution stayed, pending appeals. Those appeals dragged on for 2 years, working their way through military courts and eventually civilian courts because of jurisdictional questions. During that time, Thornhill sat in a military prison, his reputation destroyed, his career finished, his name becoming a cautionary tale taught at West Point about what happens when officers abuse their power. And then, in 1875, Thornhill died, not by execution, but by his own hand. He hanged himself in his cell using strips of cloth torn from his uniform. He left no note, no explanation, no last words. Just a body swinging from a cell bar and a legacy of blood that no amount of family money could wash away. You might think that's where the story ends, but there's more. The people of Copper Ridge received an official apology from the Secretary of War and compensation from the federal government for their losses. It wasn't much money, couldn't begin to replace the lives taken, but it was acknowledgement. The town erected a memorial in the square where the executions happened, a simple granite marker with 8 names carved into it and a line from Scripture that Eli Stone had used in his memorial sermon. The marker is still there today, weathered and worn but still readable. Margaret Wells, Thomas Garrett, Samuel Chen, Mary Sullivan, and 4 others whose names deserve to be remembered. David Hoskins, a carpenter. Anna Reeves, a seamstress. Frank Martinez, a ranch hand. Elizabeth Thornton, no relation to the colonel, a mother of 3 who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The case had broader implications, too. It became a landmark in establishing that military authority over civilians has strict limits, even in frontier territories. It led to reforms in how military operations in civilian areas were conducted and supervised. It demonstrated that soldiers have not just the right, but the obligation to refuse unlawful orders, even from superior officers. The 28 soldiers who stood against Thornhill became examples of moral courage, and several of them went on to distinguished careers specifically because of their willingness to do the right thing when it mattered most. Sergeant Robert Hayes was promoted and eventually retired as a major, spending his later years giving lectures at military academies about ethics and leadership. He always told cadets that the hardest orders to disobey are the ones that seem to come with the weight of authority behind them. But that's exactly when disobedience becomes most necessary. But what about the town itself? Copper Ridge survived, though it never fully recovered. Some families left, unable to live with the memories. Others stayed, determined to honor those who died by building something good on ground soaked with their blood. The town eventually merged with a larger settlement nearby, and the name Copper Ridge faded from maps. But the people who were there never forgot. Descendants of those families still tell the story, still visit that memorial marker, still make sure that what happened is never erased from history. Because that's the thing about injustice. You can bury it, you can try to forget it, you can let time smooth over the rough edges, but unless you remember it, unless you talk about it, unless you make sure that each generation knows what happened and why it mattered, you're doomed to repeat it. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take away from a story about a colonel who thought his uniform made him untouchable and a town that refused to let murder be forgotten? Maybe it's that power without accountability is just tyranny with better branding. Maybe it's that ordinary people, when pushed far enough, will stand up even against overwhelming force. Maybe it's that institutions, even military institutions, can self-correct when good people inside them refuse to accept wrongdoing. Maybe it's all of those things. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Maybe it's that every life matters. That Margaret Wells teaching children, and Thomas Garrett shoeing horses, and Samuel Chen treating fever, and all the others going about their quiet lives were just as important as any colonel or general or politician. They didn't have power or money or influence, but they had dignity, and no one has the right to take that away.
You know what gets me about this story? It's not just that Thornhill did what he did. Men have committed atrocities throughout history, and unfortunately, they'll probably keep doing so as long as humans exist. What gets me is how close this came to being swept under the rug. If Sergeant Hayes hadn't been brave enough to document everything, if Private Walsh hadn't ridden hard for Fort Sumner, if Colonel Mackenzie had been a different kind of officer who valued institutional reputation over justice, if any of a dozen things had gone differently, Thornhill might have gotten away with it. The 8 dead would have been footnotes, if they were remembered at all. The town would have suffered in silence. The soldiers who refused to fire would have been punished for disobedience instead of celebrated for conscience. Justice is never guaranteed. It has to be fought for, demanded, dragged into the light by people willing to risk something to make it happen. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's truth nonetheless. And here's another thing to consider. Thornhill wasn't a monster in the sense we usually mean. He wasn't crazy or sadistic or evil in some obvious, recognizable way. He was a man with too much power, too much pride, and too little oversight. He was someone who'd convinced himself that his judgment was flawless, that his authority was absolute, that the people beneath him in the social hierarchy weren't quite as human as he was. That's how atrocities happen, not through obvious evil, but through the gradual erosion of empathy, the slow acceptance of the idea that some lives matter more than others. Thornhill probably never thought of himself as a bad person. He probably believed, right up until that rope went around his neck in his cell, that he'd been doing his duty, maintaining order, making the hard decisions that weak men wouldn't make. Self-deception is one of humanity's greatest talents, and the higher up you go in any hierarchy, the easier it becomes to deceive yourself about the consequences of your actions. The soldiers who refused to fire in that square deserve special recognition. Think about what they did. They were in the military, where disobeying orders can get you executed. They were surrounded by their fellow soldiers, facing enormous peer pressure to comply. They had a commanding officer who'd already demonstrated his willingness to use violence. And yet, in that moment, they made a choice. They decided that their conscience mattered more than their career, more than their safety, more than their fear. How many of us would have that kind of courage? How many of us would stand there with a loaded rifle and refuse to fire when everyone around us was following orders? It's easy to say we would, sitting here safe and comfortable, reading about history. It's much harder to actually do it when the moment comes. Those soldiers, whose names were never publicized because military records protected their identities, were heroes in the truest sense. They saved lives. They upheld their humanity, and they paid a price for it too, in nightmares and guilt and the weight of knowing what they'd witnessed. Now, I want to talk about something that might make some of you uncomfortable, the question of revenge. Because after the trial, after Thornhill's suicide, there were people in Copper Ridge who felt cheated. They'd wanted to see him face that firing squad. They'd wanted him to experience the terror his victims felt, standing against the wall, looking at raised rifles, knowing death was coming. When he took his own life, he denied them that satisfaction, that closure, that sense of balance being restored. Some folks said his suicide was the coward's way out, one final act of selfishness that robbed his victims of justice. Others said his guilt must have been unbearable, that maybe the suicide was its own form of punishment, that living with what he'd done was worse than dying for it. Who's right? I don't know. I honestly don't. Revenge is complicated. Justice is complicated. The line between them is blurry and shifts depending on where you're standing. What I do know is that the people of Copper Ridge were entitled to their anger, to their desire to see Thornhill suffer as their loved ones had suffered. That's human. That's natural. Whether acting on that desire would have brought them peace or just more pain, well, that's something every person has to answer for themselves. Let me bring this home now, because we've been on this journey together for a while, and there are some final thoughts I need to share. The story of Copper Ridge, of Colonel Thornhill and the 8 people he had murdered, of the soldiers who refused and the soldiers who testified, of Colonel Mackenzie who demanded accountability, and Sergeant Hayes who documented the truth. This story matters because it's not really about the past. It's about right now. It's about every time someone with power abuses it and thinks they'll get away with it. It's about every time ordinary people have to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. It's about every time institutions are forced to choose between protecting their reputation and doing what's right. These situations keep happening because human nature doesn't change. The specifics differ, the technology evolves, the settings vary, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Power corrupts, especially when it's unchecked. People suffer, especially when they're vulnerable. And justice only happens when someone cares enough to fight for it. So here's what I want you to take away from this. First, remember that your voice matters. Whether you're a sergeant documenting crimes, a fort commander demanding accountability, a one-armed saloon keeper standing up to tyranny, or just someone who refuses to pull the trigger when ordered to do something wrong, your choices have weight. You might think you're insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but history is made by individuals making individual choices that accumulate into movements and changes and justice. Second, don't ever let anyone tell you that authority alone justifies action. Thornhill had authority. He had rank and uniform and legal military command. None of that made what he did right. Question authority. Demand justification. Insist on accountability. That's not disrespect. That's citizenship. Third, remember the names of the forgotten. Margaret Wells, Thomas Garrett, Samuel Chen, Mary Sullivan, David Hoskins, Anna Reeves, Frank Martinez, Elizabeth Thornton. They weren't famous, they weren't powerful, but they mattered. Their lives had value, and the fact that we're still talking about them 150 years later proves that ordinary lives can have extraordinary impact when they become symbols of injustice and the fight against it.
Before I close this out, I need you to do something for me. If this story affected you, if it made you think or feel or question or understand something you didn't before, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about the Wild West that go beyond the myths and legends to show you the real human drama, the real struggles for justice and survival and dignity. And most importantly, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about Thornhill's story. Tell me whether you think his suicide was justice or escape. Tell me what you would have done if you'd been one of those soldiers in the square. Tell me about times you've seen power being abused, or stood up against injustice, or struggled with the question of whether to speak up or stay silent. This channel is a community, and these conversations matter. Your perspectives matter, so don't be shy. Share your thoughts. Let's learn from each other. The Wild West wasn't just gunfights and outlaws and cowboys. It was also about communities trying to survive, individuals trying to do right, and the constant struggle between those who abused power and those who fought back against that abuse. Copper Ridge was one battlefield in that larger war, but there were hundreds of others, thousands of stories that need to be told and remembered and learned from. That's what we do here. That's why this channel exists, to shine light on the forgotten corners of history, to tell the stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances, and to remind you that justice isn't something that just happens. It's something people create through courage and persistence and the refusal to accept that might makes right. Colonel Marcus Thornhill thought he was above the law. He thought his position protected him. He thought the lives of people he considered beneath him didn't matter. He was wrong. History remembers him not as a military leader, but as a murderer and a coward. History remembers his victims not as nameless casualties, but as individuals with names and lives and people who loved them. And history remembers the soldiers who refused his orders, not as insubordinate, but as heroes who upheld the best values of military service by refusing to participate in atrocity. That's the power of truth.
That's the importance of documentation. That's why people like Sergeant Hayes and Colonel Mackenzie and everyone who testified at that trial deserve our respect. They made sure the truth survived. And in doing so, they made sure that 8 lives lost weren't lost in vain.
You know what haunts me most about this whole thing? It's the children. Young Daniel, that 16-year-old apprentice who survived with a bullet wound, lived the rest of his life with nightmares about standing against that wall. The 3 kids Elizabeth Thornhill left behind grew up without their mother because a colonel's pride was wounded. The students in Margaret Wells' classroom lost not just a teacher, but someone who believed in them, who saw potential in children that the world might otherwise overlook. Think about all the lessons those kids never learned, all the encouragement they never received, all the difference one dedicated teacher might have made in their lives. When you murder someone, you don't just take one life. You take all the lives that person would have touched, all the good they would have done, all the love they would have shared. Thornhill didn't just kill 8 people that morning. He killed possibilities, futures, dreams. He created holes in families and communities that never fully healed. And for what? Because Patrick O'Malley wouldn't apologize for stopping a drunk soldier from shooting someone? Because the colonel's authority was questioned? The disproportion between the offense and the response is staggering. And that disproportion is itself a crime. There's a letter that survived from this period, written by Daniel's mother to Sergeant Hayes after the trial. She'd heard about Hayes documenting everything and making sure Private Walsh got that information to Colonel Mackenzie, and she wanted to thank him. The letter is in the Territorial Archives now, yellowed and faded, but still readable, and there's one line that breaks my heart every time I think about it. She wrote, "You gave my son a chance to see justice done while he still believed justice was possible. For that, I am grateful beyond words, because I would rather raise a son who trusts in right than one who lives in fear of might." Think about that. This woman who'd come so close to losing her child, who'd watched her community be terrorized, who had every reason to be bitter and cynical and broken, still believed that teaching her son to trust in justice mattered more than anything else. That's strength. That's hope. That's the human spirit refusing to be crushed even when it has every excuse to give up. The ripple effects of what happened in Copper Ridge went further than anyone expected. Remember those 28 soldiers who met in secret to plan resistance if Thornhill wasn't held accountable? After the trial, after they'd testified and been recognized for their courage, several of them formed an informal network. They corresponded with each other throughout their military careers, and whenever they heard about officers abusing their authority or soldiers being ordered to do things that crossed ethical lines, they'd investigate quietly and report up the chain of command. They became, in essence, an internal watchdog group, using their experiences in Copper Ridge to identify and stop other potential atrocities before they happened. There's no official record of this network because it operated outside formal structures, but mentions of it appear in personal letters and journals. One of the members, a corporal named James Donnelly, wrote in his diary about stopping an officer from burning a Native American village in retaliation for a raid. Donnelly went directly to the fort commander, bypassed the abusive officer completely, and provided evidence that the village in question hadn't been involved in any raids. The attack was called off. Lives were saved. And none of it would have happened if Donnelly hadn't learned in Copper Ridge that sometimes the chain of command needs to be circumvented to prevent injustice.
This is what I mean when I say the story matters beyond its immediate facts. The people involved in Copper Ridge, both the victims and those who sought justice for them, created a legacy. They proved that accountability was possible. They demonstrated that military power has limits. They showed that ordinary people standing together could challenge extraordinary authority. And they inspired others to do the same in their own contexts.
That's how change happens, not through grand gestures or famous leaders, though those have their place, but through individuals making choices in specific moments that create precedents and possibilities for others. Margaret Wells probably never imagined that her decision to speak up at a town meeting would eventually contribute to military reform and inspire soldiers to resist unlawful orders. Thomas Garrett probably just thought he was protecting his neighbors when he stood with her. Samuel Chen was a doctor trying to save lives, not a political activist making a statement. But their actions and their deaths mattered. They sent a message that echoed through time. Now, let's talk about William Jessup for a minute, because his story deserves attention too. This was the man who informed on the town's plans, who told Thornhill about the delegation that was going to report him to higher authorities, who set in motion the chain of events that led to the executions. After the massacre, Jessup was ostracized by the community. People wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't do business with him, wanted nothing to do with him. He'd gambled away his integrity for what he thought would be favor from Thornhill, and instead he'd gotten blood on his hands and isolation from everyone he knew. At the trial, when Jessup testified about his role and broke down crying on the witness stand, there was no sympathy in the courtroom. Even the prosecutors who needed his testimony treated him with barely concealed contempt. Here's the thing, though. After the trial, Jessup didn't leave town. He stayed. He lived with what he'd done. He spent the next 20 years doing whatever work people would give him, usually the jobs no one else wanted, and he gave away every penny he earned beyond what he needed for basic survival. He donated money to the families of the victims, he maintained the memorial marker, he attended every anniversary service held for those who died. He never made excuses, never asked for forgiveness, never tried to rehabilitate his reputation. He just lived with his guilt and tried, in whatever small ways he could, to make amends. When he died in 1893, the town buried him in the cemetery, but not near the victims. His grave is off by itself, separated from the community even in death. There's a strange kind of integrity in that, isn't there? Not the integrity of doing the right thing to begin with, but the integrity of facing consequences without running from them, of acknowledging guilt without seeking absolution you don't deserve.
I bring up Jessup because his story complicates the narrative. It would be easy to divide everyone into heroes and villains, good people and bad people, those who resisted and those who collaborated. But real life is messier than that. Jessup made a terrible choice, a cowardly choice, a choice that contributed to deaths. He was also desperate, scared, and exploited by someone with more power and fewer scruples. Does that excuse what he did? No. Does it make him sympathetic? Not really. Does it make him human? Absolutely. And that humanity, that complexity, is important to acknowledge. Because if we tell ourselves that only monsters commit atrocities or enable them, then we blind ourselves to how ordinary people under pressure can make devastating choices. Jessup wasn't a monster. He was a weak man in a bad situation who made the wrong call. And there, but for the grace of God, as they say, go all of us. We'd like to think we'd be the soldiers who refused to fire, the townspeople who stood up, the officers who demanded accountability. But would we? Or might we, in the wrong circumstances with the wrong pressures, be Jessup? That's an uncomfortable question, but it's one worth asking. Let me shift gears and talk about something that often gets overlooked in stories about frontier justice and military atrocities: the role of documentation. Sergeant Robert Hayes's decision to write down everything that happened, to collect testimony from other soldiers, to create a formal record rather than just relying on word of mouth, that was crucial. Written documentation has power that spoken testimony alone doesn't. It can be copied, distributed, preserved. It's harder to dismiss or distort.
It creates an official record that future generations can examine. Hayes understood this instinctively. He'd been in the military long enough to know that without documentation, Thornhill could claim anything, could say the townspeople were armed or threatening or collaborating with outlaws, and it would be his word against theirs, an officer against civilians. But with detailed written testimony from multiple soldiers, with dates and times and specific facts, the truth became much harder to obscure. This is why authoritarian regimes throughout history have always tried to control information and destroy records. Because documentation is evidence, and evidence makes accountability possible.
Think about how this applies today. When you witness injustice, when you see something wrong happening, document it. Write it down, photograph it, record it, save it, back it up. Get details, get corroboration. Create a record that can't be easily denied or dismissed. I'm not saying you should put yourself in danger or violate laws or do anything reckless, but within the bounds of safety and legality, documentation is one of the most powerful tools ordinary people have to hold power accountable. Sergeant Hayes didn't have a camera or recording device. He had paper and pen and determination, and that was enough to help bring down a colonel and change military policy. Imagine what we can do today with the technology available to us if we have the same determination and moral clarity that Hayes demonstrated. Another aspect of this story worth examining is Colonel Mackenzie's role. He would have been well within his rights, within military tradition even, to investigate quietly, to handle things internally, to protect the Army's reputation by keeping the details contained. Instead, he made the trial public. He allowed journalists to attend. He didn't try to minimize or spin what had happened. Why? According to his own testimony at various points, because he believed the Army's reputation would be better served by demonstrating accountability than by hiding crimes. He believed that the public seeing the military police itself, seeing officers held to the same standards as enlisted men, seeing justice done even when it meant admitting institutional failure, that would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the military standing. He was right. The Copper Ridge trial, despite exposing military wrongdoing, actually increased public trust in the Army's justice system. It showed that the institution was capable of self-correction, that it valued honor over expediency. This is a lesson every institution should learn. Cover-ups always come out eventually. And when they do, they're twice as damaging because they prove not just that something bad happened, but that leaders tried to hide it. Transparency and accountability, even when painful, build credibility. Secrecy and protection of wrongdoers destroy it.
We're coming toward the end of our time together, but I want to make sure you understand why stories like this one matter so much to me personally, and why I think they should matter to you too. The Wild West is often romanticized, turned into myth, reduced to stereotypes about cowboys and gunfighters and lawless frontier towns where might made right. And sure, some of that existed. But there was also this. There were communities trying to build something decent. There were people fighting for justice, for accountability, for the principle that no one is above the law. There were moments of moral courage that shine across the decades and remind us what humans are capable of at their best. If we only tell the romanticized stories, if we only focus on the outlaws and the shootouts and the adventures, we miss the real heart of what the frontier was about. It was about people trying to create civilization in difficult circumstances. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they failed. And sometimes, as in Copper Ridge, they paid a terrible price for standing up for what they believed was right. But they did it anyway. That deserves to be remembered. There's a quote from Margaret Wells that survived because one of her students, who was too young to be at that final town meeting but heard about it from her parents, remembered it years later. Wells apparently said, "We teach our children that America is a place where rights matter,
where justice exists, where people are equal before the law. If we don't stand up when those principles are violated, what are we teaching them? That all those words are just pretty lies? I'd rather die standing for truth than live comfortably in lies. And she did die standing for truth. She died with her students' future in her heart and a belief in justice on her lips. How do you measure the worth of a life like that? How do you calculate the impact of someone who valued principle over safety? You can't, not really. But you can honor it. You can remember it. You can try to live up to the standard she set.
The memorial marker in what used to be Copper Ridge, that simple granite stone with 8 names carved into it, still gets visitors. Not many, because the place is remote, and the town that used to be there is long gone. But people come. Historians researching military history, descendants of the soldiers who testified, family members of the victims who want to stand where their ancestors stood and died. And according to local reports, someone, no one knows who, places fresh flowers on that marker every year on the anniversary of the executions. For 150 years, through wars and depressions and social upheaval, someone has made sure those flowers appear. Maybe it's descendants of survivors. Maybe it's some local history enthusiast. Maybe it's a ghost, who knows? But the fact that it happens, that someone still cares enough to honor those 8 lives, tells you something important about the human need for remembrance and meaning. We can't bring the dead back. We can't undo injustice that's already occurred. But we can make sure it's not forgotten. We can make sure it means something. And maybe, just maybe, we can use the lessons learned to prevent the next atrocity. Stop the next Thornhill. Save the next 8 lives. So here's my final challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on. Don't just be entertained or informed and then forget about it tomorrow. Take something from this story into your life. Maybe it's a commitment to speak up when you see authority being abused. Maybe it's a decision to document injustice when you encounter it. Maybe it's just a reminder that your voice matters, your choices matter, your willingness to stand for principle over convenience matters. The people of Copper Ridge weren't special. They weren't heroes or saints or extraordinary in any obvious way. They were ordinary folks who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and did what they thought was right. Some of them paid the ultimate price for that. Others lived with trauma and grief for the rest of their lives. But they didn't stay silent. They didn't accept that might makes right. And because of their courage, because of their sacrifice, military policy changed. Soldiers learned to resist unlawful orders, and 8 names that might have been forgotten are still spoken with respect a century and a half later.
Before we close out, I want to remind you one more time, if this story moved you, hit that like button. If you want more stories like this, real history from the Wild West that goes beyond the Hollywood myths to show you the complicated truth about justice, power, and the human capacity for both terrible evil and incredible courage, subscribe to this channel. We post new content every week, and I promise you, every story is researched, verified, and told with the respect that real history deserves. And please, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about Colonel Thornhill. Tell me whether you believe his suicide was adequate justice or a coward's escape. Tell me what you would have done if you'd been Sergeant Hayes, or one of those soldiers in the square, or a citizen of Copper Ridge trying to decide whether to resist or comply. Tell me about times you've seen authority abused, or stood up against injustice, or struggled with the moral complexity of a difficult situation. This isn't just a channel, it's a community of people who believe history matters, who think critically about power and justice, and who want to learn from the past rather than just be entertained by it. Your voice is part of that community, and I want to hear it.
The story of Copper Ridge, of Colonel Marcus Thornhill and the civilians he ordered executed, of the soldiers who refused and testified, of the communities that sought justice and the officers who demanded accountability. This is American history, not the sanitized, simplified version we sometimes get in textbooks, but the real, complicated, morally challenging version that forces us to think about who we are and what we value. It's a story about the worst of human nature, the pride and cruelty and dehumanization that can lead one man to order the deaths of 8 innocent people. But it's also a story about the best of human nature, the courage and integrity and commitment to principle that can lead 28 soldiers to risk their careers, a sergeant to document truth at personal danger, a colonel to demand accountability despite institutional pressure, and a community to refuse to let murder be forgotten or forgiven.
This is the Wild West you need to know about. Not just the gunfights and the outlaws, though those stories have their place, but the struggles for justice, the battles against tyranny, the moments when ordinary people had to decide whether to bow to power or stand up for principle. These stories matter because they're not really about the past. They're about human nature, about power dynamics, about the eternal struggle between authority and accountability, between might and right. They're about choices every generation faces in one form or another. And they remind us that the choices we make matter, that individuals can make a difference, that justice is never automatic but always has to be fought for and defended and insisted upon by people who care enough to pay the cost. Margaret Wells, Thomas Garrett, Samuel Chen, Mary Sullivan, David Hoskins, Anna Reeves, Frank Martinez, Elizabeth Thornton. 8 names, 8 lives, 8 people who were murdered because a colonel's pride was wounded and his power was unchecked. They deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told, and the lessons of what happened to them deserve to be learned, passed on, and applied by every generation that comes after. That's why we're here. That's why this channel exists. That's why your engagement, your comments, your willingness to share these stories with others matters so much. History isn't just what happened in the past. It's what we choose to remember, what we learn from, and what we carry forward into the future. So remember Copper Ridge. Remember the civilians who stood up and paid the price. Remember the soldiers who refused to fire. Remember the officers who demanded accountability. And remember that you, right now, in your own life and circumstances, have the power to stand up, speak out, document truth, and insist on justice when you see it being denied. That's the legacy of Copper Ridge. That's the challenge these 8 lives leave us. And that's why their story, painful as it is, needs to be told and retold and never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about real history. Thank you for being part of this community. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember that the Wild West wasn't just about the fastest gun. It was about who stood up when it mattered most. And sometimes, the real heroes weren't the ones who survived, but the ones who refused to back down, even when backing down might have saved their lives. That's courage. That's integrity. And that's what we honor when we remember Copper Ridge.